Good morning. It's Tuesday and a sunny, cold Bathurst morning, and welcome to all our Facebook followers who are joining us this morning for our live session. Today we've got a special treat. We've got Ann Harrison, who is a really dear friend of mine. I've known Ann for around about 8 or 9 years now, when I participated in her first BreathWork training course, which I did over a 12-month period and learned all the intricacies of BreathWork, and we're going to have some lovely discussions about that today. So I just want to say, Ann, thank you for coming in on a cold Bathurst morning all the way.
Thank you for inviting me.
So I wanted to start off by first of all asking you about, just to sort of talk a little bit about yourself and what your interests are in breathwork and what you're actually doing.
Okay, so I started in the mid-80s, in 1985, when I was a university lecturer, avoiding the deadline of a chapter of a textbook I was writing. And someone said, come along to this introduction to breathwork. And I had such an amazing experience. It was Friday night, Saturday morning, and Sunday morning. So I thought I could do everything. I could write the end of the chapter, and I could do this. And I had one of those extraordinary nameless experiences that made me think, well, I've got to train in this. Never in thinking I would ever work. I just liked the effects, which were ecstatic. I mean, from the breathwork that I do, it can be agony or ecstasy and the whole range in between. Mm-hmm. But at that period for me, it was ecstatic. And I went to China after that to continue studying martial arts and set up a retreat meditation centre in Hong Kong in the countryside a couple of years after that, which is where I developed all the trainings, really. And it was in the early 2000s that I got together with other Australian trainers, and we developed government-accredited breathwork. So for a period of about 12 years, we had a Certificate 3, 4 and diploma of breathwork.
Which is one of the ones that I did.
That's right.
That
you
was
did
one of the ones
You
that I
did one of those special accredited ones, so you've got the government imprimatur on it.
So pioneering work.
Pioneering work. It was.
Pioneering work.
And now it's. I watch the new trainers come up, and I think it's amazing because when I started, it was fringe, it was woo-woo, it was certainly not something you'd want to put your hand up to, and now it's everywhere.
It's pretty mainstream, and I think it's one of the things that we've already talked about on the Facebook Live. I've touched on this a few times, is that a lot of the herbal treatments that I prescribe these days are because of the work I did with Anne and the connections that I made between the body and the brain and the basically the way the gut works through the vagus nerve, and that led me to do a little bit of research on the polyvagal theory, because I found all of these theories, which were also very fringe back then.
That's right.
Which I think now is becoming much more mainstream, as you're saying. So you're witnessing here some pioneering work here with Anne,
and that's why I love that, because you had the knowledge to make the connections. I have the energetic, breath, emotional knowledge, and you had the other technical herbal knowledge to put it all together.
Yeah.
And if we operate from a systems theory, the body mind is a whole system.
Of course.
And so you can go into it from the herbs, or you can go into the breath, or the mind. Although that's much harder. And so you've been tell me more about that, because we actually haven't had a time to tell me the treatments and the ways of working that you developed.
Yeah. So what I think the key thing that I did work out through this whole process was the connection between the hypothalamus, the thyroid, and the adrenal systems, and of course the vagus nerve, and the single most connection, which is the vagus nerve, which is an afferent nerve, which connects the brain and the gut axis. And of course this is part of what we know as the endocrine system, the neuroendocrine system. So a lot of the work that I do and the herbs that I prescribe are influencing the nervous system, the vagus nerve specifically, with the intention to balance the hormones that are being affected by those nerve plexuses. And I think the important thing to remember, and I guess this is where those ideas about where the brain and the brain chemicals, where they all started to sort of, where this really started to happen for me was during the breathwork sessions, because I realised that brain chemistry was totally affected by my emotions. And I connected to that. And then I found a book by Candace Pert,
Yes.
which was Molecules of Emotion. And so I was able to really do this research to say, rightio, we're not dealing with some strange mental health issues. We're dealing with a whole gamut of misfiring neurons, misinformation through the nervous system, and misinformation through the immune system. That is where I decided that was where all my therapeutic focus had to be. And the other difference is, because I was trained by Dorothy Hall as a herbalist, I mean, I think she in a way had already got quite a lot of this idea, but she was coming from a traditional perspective, so none of this science was available. So
That's right.
so whilst she was really I had a really good clarity on always needing to have a nervine included in any of her formulas, and I'm sure the reason was in the end, obvious in practice why you would do that. So she had a very complex system. Well, it's actually not quite complex, it's quite a simple system really, based on personality types and nervine herbs. I've sort of stepped a little bit further than that to try and expand on what she had and try and research why that was effective. And this is where breathwork had led me through into that training. And of course, as a result of that, I'm now able to really understand how women's hormones work, why women are more susceptible to these sorts of imbalances than even what men are actually, because the female reproductive system and the hormones are so affected by these stressful factors.
I salute you, because I read the research, because I'm in the field. I have no idea I don't want to remember it, but I know it's important for certain people to come into the body-mind work through the intellect. So they need the knowledge that you can impart. But, the breathing patterns change the function, how the vagal nerve functions.
Absolutely.
And so in a breath session, in a breath session in the form of psychotherapy, you're working with a flowing breath. And it's a meditation, because you're focusing 100% on the feeling of the breath, the body, and the emotions that can arise, or the physical effects of it, and you're letting it flow. So when people are wanting the total well-being, I think the entry point is, of course, where you're comfortable. If you're comfortable with herbs, then you go with herbs. If you're comfortable with emotions, then you go with emotions, but you need the balance. So at some point, you need to look at what goes into your mouth as well as how you think, and the awareness of the breath and the body and the emotions to find that balance.
I think one of the things that I really like about the breath work is that it retrains the body memory. And I think it's actually something that I work with as quite strongly with each of the herbs formulas that we put together, and why our programs are the length they are. There's some really interesting research by a fellow called Rupert Sheldrake, who talks about morphogenic fields. So if you're familiar with him as well, Anne, Anne and I know a lot because we swap texts actually.
We swap texts then, because from a systems point of view, if you're working holistically, and holistically is another way of saying you using systems theory, you know that you can come into the system through a whole lot of ways, whether it's the energy field or whether it's food or herbs or mind or emotions, breath.
Because we're living in an interconnected system.
Exactly.
The whole world is, and then you can expand that to the universe as well. But we'll just stay local. We'll stay local
dip
today.
in and out of our body minds,
Exactly.
but it's been great this in this period of time. I think people have really got it. The world is interconnected, and we are connected with everyone else.
Exactly. And of course, so getting back to what I was saying about how important herbs and breathwork are in terms of creating this new habit. And the new habit is doing several things. It's informing the body on how to function, number one. Number two, it's also rebuilding cells. So if we're rebuilding the body over a period of time, we need the information in the body to be correct. So partly it's the breath work, partly it's the emotions, and partly it's our nutrition. And of course the herbs are also informing the body on how to repair. So that happens over a fairly long period of time.
I got excited when you said when we need the information in the body to be correct, which is where my speciality with emotions comes in, because if we've got suppressed emotions, if we've swallowed down the pain of our life, it acts as a distorting filter to the information that's accessible to us. And we don't know, either in receiving it or expressing ourselves, that there is this distorting filter of emotions that is in the body-mind. So working with the herbs and then working with the emotions, they go together, because then if you work with the emotions, you get that clear knowledge of what's happening and what's going on.
I think it's interesting because when I met Anne, and this is just a little anecdote, I had my office down next to a little local cafe called The Hub, which was where everybody used to hang out and have coffee. Still there, actually, by the way. But when I was in that little practice, Anne came in and said, I'm doing some breathwork workshops. Well, I looked at her and I burst out crying. And it was the most extraordinary experience, because I didn't understand why I burst out crying. This lovely lady coming in, and I have people coming in all the time, and next thing you know, I'm crying. And I'm thinking, I need to see this lady. So I rang her and I said, I think I need to come and do what you're talking about. So that's where that started. So I think we have a question.
Yeah, you have a question for me.
Yeah.
Can we just get a very simple explanation about what a breathwork session is? Just for the people who don't know anything about breathwork,
Okay.
tell us about breathwork.
Okay.
What it actually is.
So in the form that I do it, because breathwork could be qigong, it could be meditation of breath awareness, but in the form that I do it, it ranges from a psychotherapy to a spiritual practice, and the technique is really simple. It's connecting and flowing the breath. We all experience it if we're jogging, walking fast, going up a flight of stairs. The in and the out breaths flow into each other. Now, if it's out there in the world, that flow means that we can propel ourselves along to wherever it is we want to go. But if we're lying down, as happens in a session, lying down, then that flowing breath propels us inward in the inner journey. And what it does is it releases suppressed emotions, source unconscious beliefs and attitudes, releases them, and in an expanded state, you're able to reprogram yourself the way you want to. So a session is normally about 2 hours long, and about fully an hour and a quarter of that is the breathing, the conscious connected breathing. So you're flowing the breath. And my job is to keep you on track, or keep the client in front of me on track, because when we have a strong emotion in an event, we go, everything in the nervous system, or if we're pulling ourselves together really strong, the core tenses, the throat tenses, and we breathe shallowly. That seems to affect the mental emotional component of that incident and lock it into the cells of the body. So flowing the breath, this is the best explanation we've got to date, but I've been doing for more than 30 years, so I just use it like this. It flushes up what we consciously or unconsciously have put ourselves together to deal with, or have been shocked, like a trauma of someone coming home and finding their spouse dead. Speechless, wordless, breathless, and the trauma goes into the body. So in reversing that process, a person needs support and someone who has the ability to accept really intense emotion. And there's not a training really in our society in mental health that gives you a training to handle intense emotions. And you've just got to think of all the intensity that we have in our life, the pain, the suffering, the confusion, not knowing what to do with the emotions. So we stuff it in some way. And at the very least, we lodge it in the body, which over time creates chronic illnesses. And so 2 hour session, most of that is flowing the breath, and the purpose of it is to release those emotions that have locked in the body, source unconscious beliefs and attitudes, because you go into an expanded state of consciousness and release whatever it is. And because you're in that expanded state, you can literally change your mind. Not like you can in already everyday consciousness, but you can change your mind. And
Because it changes the chemistry of your body.
yeah.
So this is the key thing.
Yeah.
It changes the way your neurons are working. It changes the information that's happening into your body. So therefore, the changing your mind isn't just your brain doing it. It's your whole body and feeling is doing it. And this is this is probably based on some of that Bruce Lipton stuff, where if you feel it, dream it, you can do it, kind of stuff. You've got to be careful not to get too out there in unreal thinking about that, because it is about making sure that your mind and body is connected at the level that it's meant to be at, not in some imagined place.
Exactly.
Because if it's an imagined place, it's called spiritual bypassing.
Exactly.
Or emotional bypassing. You're not processing it properly.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So it's about being. It's in fact it's becoming real, is what I'll say.
Becoming real, and I think everyone knows that when they have a goal, sometimes it's just a wish. But when you have the goal and the vision, you feel it in your body. It'll work this time, and the body switches on, and it'll work this time, and it does.
Yeah. Exactly. And I think because I was with the training I did, I was actually taught to do some of that witnessing and sitting in witness to the partner in the process, which I found. I mean, I had to do a lot of work myself in order to be able to be present to help people, because what you'll find happening is, you'll often be triggered by other people's experiences. So in my journey, I remember it was a really, really interesting thing, and it is quite psychedelic. It was more psychedelic for me than my partner. I remember my partner being very, very emotional, but I was actually a bit more psychedelic with my experiences.
and there's such a range of experience but that being present, the training that you did and that goes on into level 2, in order to be present with someone, you have not got to have any unprocessed emotions in your body. So if there's unprocessed emotions in your body, you can't be present while someone else is going into their pain. And one of the people you worked with, it took her virtually the whole course not to sit and cry while she was with another person, because the pain in the person that was doing the breath work would trigger her own pain, and it would just flow out of us. But by the end of the course, she could be present, and the pain that she was carrying in her body had largely gone.
Had largely gone and processed. And for me, it was more of, yes, there was pain, but it was also more about post-traumatic stress for me more than anything. And there's grief as part of that, and there's anger as part of that, and there's all these range of emotions that you go through when you're processing these sorts of things.
And you don't have normally the safety, the space, or the person that can be with you.
That's right.
While you just let it go without judgment.
Yeah, one of the things that I found incredibly valuable in my personal journey with Anne, and I think this is something that, and I say this a lot to people that are on the phone talking to me if they're having a consultation with me, if they're grieving, how important it is that there is someone who can witness their pain. The witness of the pain is an acknowledgement of you at your deepest level, and I think that we're taught as in our society to reject pain or to reject grief, actually, and we're not allowed to grieve. Grieving is kind of like something that's a damn inconvenience, really, for most people. But a lot of grief can be quite debilitating and incapacitating. And so, your choices, if you've had a massive amount of grief in your life, having someone to just acknowledge that grief, and I've actually been talking to quite a few people on the phone recently who aren't getting that support in our community, and they're remote people, and because I've done this training, I have been able to help them, but I try to encourage them to call Lifeline, all those sorts of people, but most people I try to recommend to try and connect with a local breath worker if they can.
It's on that point of not being witnessed. or not having our grief or our emotion accepted. The problem is also that we often don't accept it ourselves.
Yeah, that's right.
And so we try to soldier on regardless. And if we've got willpower and intelligence, we can have a whole lot of strategies that will allow that until the build-up becomes so great that we fall apart in some way.
Which is when Anne came into my office. That's exactly what happened. Okay, we have a question, I think.
I'm not sure they can hear me, so I'll ask you.
Yeah.
So there's a difference between, or is there a difference between grieving for yourself if you've got a terminal illness and grieving for somebody else who's got a terminal illness, a relative, whatever?
Well, okay. So do you want to repeat that question?
Is there a difference between grieving for yourself and grieving for someone else? And
Who's dealing with grief?
Who's dealing with grief? Yeah. Grief in the body, as you'll say in a minute, is the same. Its implications in the practicality of looking after someone who's dying or preparing one's own exit, the practicalities are different, but the what it is in the body is the same. So sorry. So what it is in the body is the same. So do you want to say something?
Yeah, I think one of the things that I do with herbs when people are going through grief is grieving is actually a really, really exhausting process. So I find that a lot of people who are grieving have adrenal fatigue, they have thyroid imbalances, they'll often have hormonal imbalances. So and if you're being diagnosed by a doctor, they often call that a mood disorder. So and you don't want to confuse grief with depression. I think that and anxiety, which we might talk about that in a minute, but I think the key thing here is with herbs, we really want to try and make sure that the body is really well supported. And I like to use herbs, for example, withania or ashwagandha as it's known. It's an Ayurvedic herb. It was actually a herb that was used through the Vedic practices with yogis, because they would often come to a point in their practice where their body could no longer either process appropriately or they just got stuck with their practice. And so herbs were used to help bring them to the next level because it was acknowledged that the system could no longer process what it could process because it just didn't have the energy to do so anymore. So that's one thing that I do with the herbs is I make sure that the central nervous system is really strong, all those corresponding nerve plexuses are strong, the adrenal system and all those endocrine systems are strong. And of course, detoxing from excess hormones that are being produced through these processes is really critical. So having good kidney and liver support is essential.
Yeah, and I wanted to add that often we're frightened of the intensity of our own emotion. So if it's grief, I know from personal experience, I felt one time as if I would either implode, explode, or I'd break apart. The intensity in my physical body was enormous. And no one tells us that this is normal. This is a normal part. So we add to that
the suppression factor.
Exactly.
And I think so if you are in a situation where you're grieving, just be aware that it's a very normal process to feel really, really fatigued, and that sleeping a lot's okay. Yeah. And surrendering to that process is okay, so long as you're also nourishing your body appropriately.
Emotions get felt in the body when they're intense. So accepting that of oneself and just looking with a dispassionate eye, oh my gosh, this is what's happening with my grief in my body. And from then my point of view, I'll say, okay, and so relax the breath, breathe a little bit deeper. Keep watching and imagine that some of that intensity is leaving with the out breath. And it will. And it will. Yeah.
And I think the same is with anxiety as well. I remember, because I was a person that was on the go all the time and I was dealing with a little bit of with grief. My mother had passed away and a few other things were happening at that time when I met Anne, and trying to manage the business, etc., all on my own. All these things did come into my awareness, and just sitting still was difficult for me. And I remember having to sit in my discomfort for a long time and becoming very uncomfortable and getting, accepting my discomfort in my body.
So having heard that, and if that happens, just know that sitting in the discomfort and breathing more deeply and more gently, not just 1 or 2 or 3 deep breaths, but breathing more deeply, more gently, and say, I'm learning about the emotional, mental, body connection. And I'll be able to, when I get through this, be so much more aware and able to deal with what comes at me in life.
Are there any questions coming up?
So the difference between suppression and depression?
Suppression and depression. Do you want to talk about maybe the difference between what your take on anxiety and depression is, which I always understood was a cycle of, it's the same thing in extreme.
So the way I've identified it with clients is that if there is substantial trauma in someone's life and they've had to deal with it for a long period of time, the consequences of trying to deal with it and keep a lid on it is a waning of energy, and that goes for the whole body-mind system. So they're literally depressed. They've got no hope. They've got no energy to envisage a future, and it's like, oh my God. So then they might find something that jumps them out of it, whether it's a medication or whether it's a holiday, and they're feeling good. But if that deep trauma is not dealt with, it begins to bubble up to the surface, and that's when
you get anxious.
That's exactly right. So you want to add to that?
Yeah. So when I'm treating that with herbs, the first thing when I have somebody who wants to talk to me about depression, and I'll just say that I do help people with depression. If they're on medication, I don't recommend certain herbs with people that are on medication, but by and large you can use herbs alongside most medications. And I'm careful about which ones I prescribe, of course. But what my aim is for people that have depression is to make sure that their adrenal system is working well, the thyroid's working well, and their central nervous system is working well. And I explain to them that part of this journey over this next 12-week period, which is usually a 12-week cycle of I guess it's creating new habits in the body. What we're trying to do is get them to a point where they will possibly start to feel anxiousness, because anxiousness actually is the way out.
Exactly.
Interestingly enough.
Yeah.
So people, always going, I'm feeling anxious. So they want to stop the anxiety. But what we're saying is we need to sit with the anxiety and breathe more deeply. And if your body's been nourished appropriately, then you can process the anxiety.
Exactly.
So that's the whole point of it. I think I used the analogy a couple of weeks ago about hitting the tuning fork. And you have this tuning fork, say, for example, and you hit it, and it's got vibration in the body. Well, imagine that the trauma that's in your life is that point when you hit the tuning fork and it's vibrating, and then before it has a chance to stop vibrating just naturally, you put a vacuum over it.
Yeah.
And it stops it. And that's what the depression, that's what basically you're doing in your own body. If you get a shock, your body has to vibrate, and normally it would go through this process, but you stop it somehow.
Yeah, there's great work by Peter Levine on dealing somatically with trauma, and he will sit, and there's some great videos online about working with war vets coming back to the States, and having a nervous tick like this that was installed there, as was his anxiety and depression, when his little group was blown up. And so it was his protection of himself. And so Peter, it's a great video to go and watch, just coaches him to be present to what was in that movement. And so as being present to that allowed it to be normalized, it to be accepted, to be witnessed, as you were saying, and to whatever was chemically, energetically stuck in the body to be released. It's wonderful stuff. So being present and not being frightened or judgmental of your body, your mind, or your emotions is absolutely crucial.
So this brings me to, and I think some of our listeners might even be interested in this, is how us as riders are impacting our horses. And I think, like I'm a trainer, and I spent all weekend riding this last 3 days.
Yeah.
Now I'm retraining a mare at the moment who I purchased as a brood mare. I don't know if she's pregnant. We're going to find out shortly if she's pregnant or not. But she's a really nice mare, and I wanted to ride her. But she's clearly had trauma in her life, and I've been working with her quietly, trying to get her reintroduced. Whereas yesterday, she was going really well. Then all of a sudden, the boogie monster's coming out in her. So I had to really work hard with her.
Yeah.
Even though I'd gone through step by step with her, breathing with her, showed her the concern. So clearly she's got some serious trauma in her body, in her mind as well.
Exactly.
In her body and mind. So I'm interested to see whether or not we can access this for
Yes,
horses.
exactly.
Can we do it?
Well, I was just thinking how similar that is to a human, because if we recognise we've got trauma, we go and seek help with it. I've had yet another example, but one very recently. Thought a client thought, I'm fine now. I'm really fine, and then coming back and said, I'll do the training. I realised that my fineness was a veneer, which was too thin, and it cracked open again. And so knowing that healing deep trauma is an ongoing process. And for me, it's non-verbal primarily, because the mind just gets in the way and creates stories and confusion for us. But with this horse, I'll be really interested, because to work, if I was with a client, so a client would come and do some sessions with me, and they'd feel good. I'm fine now. And I'd sort of know that they're probably not. And then they'll come back. And yeah, I think I need some more sessions. And really normalising, you can only, the body-mind system can only take so much change at once, whether it's change for the better or change for the worse. It can only take so much change at once.
Which is why healing's always so slow. So, for anyone who's watching who is taking any of our herbal programs for themselves, their dogs or their horses, that's why the programs are so long.
Yeah.
Because it's a renewal process. It's a new habit forming process, which is the morphogenic fields and the Rupert Sheldrake's research. There's a lot that's involved in transforming at a cellular level.
Yes, and the initial part though is having the right framework, having the right intellectual understanding of a body-mind system and what the process of healing will take, instead of quick fix.
That's right.
I should be able to handle this now.
That's right.
No.
And that was evidence to me yesterday with this mare, because I thought that I had done a reasonable. I've only had her probably, I suppose 5 months, 6 months. But she's going to take a long time. And a lot of that work that I've been doing with her has just been leading her around. For example, just leading her around the arena. Yeah. Leading her around past strange objects until and it's not so much a trust in me. I mean, yes, she's got a trust in me, but she's just got a trust that she's okay to do it. That it's okay.
Everything you could say about that, about that horse, it holds true for humans.
Exactly, exactly. And I think the interesting thing is that we need to remember that humans and animals are biologically the same. Any mammal that has, can look out of its eyes and form bonds with you or anyone else has exactly the same chemistry going on in our body. Yeah. So we need to understand that and respect that. And that's one of the biggest issues that I think we have in our culture with industrialised farming. That's another ethical issue altogether. But, we need to start recognising animals as having this sentient type of thing.
So why do we think there's been an explosion of anxiety in children and young adults? I don't think it's necessarily from trauma.
That's interesting.
Can we help? Can we help them?
That's really interesting, Anne. I think you. I'll let you answer that.
Another question about ADHD.
Yeah.
Children and breathwork, basically, and anxiety.
I think that there's an overload on the body-mind system in a society that's generally intensely overloaded. That's not to even take account of the electromagnetic fields, anything that is sort of questionable. just the amount of activity that we're assaulted by, that we've as children or even as adults, but especially as children. I mean, I can remember. I'm older than most people, I reckon, and I can remember having time to sit and stare, or just do nothing for the afternoon. When does that happen? Even if you're doing nothing, you're not really, because you're on the iPad or something like that. There is constant bombardment of the senses and emotional demands to be able to handle it all, and that's enough to drive anyone crazy. What do you think?
So yeah, no, I totally agree, Anne. I think that over stimulation is one of the key problems, and it's overstimulation in a negative way, because if you're overstimulating a young system that has not yet been taught to cope with and manage its own emotions well, so it's as a little organism. And I remember when I grew up. I mean, I grew up on a farm like you, and I mean, I just spent countless hours wandering around without anything to do, just wandering around in nature and playing with animals. Now, this is something that I just observe most children do not experience anymore at all, and I think that overstimulation. So there's a couple of other things that are going on there. I mean, we've got a nutritional deficiency going on in the world because of what's happening with our foods. The general food issues. Look, there's a whole heap of other factors, but I think number one, overstimulation
and no time to regenerate.
Process, and of course we're wanting young people to perform in schools really, really quickly. We want particularly boys. I see boys as being probably the most challenged by this. My son was supposedly ADD when he was in kindergarten, and it had nothing to do with ADD. What it had to do with was a whole heap of other factors which I dealt with. And look, by the time he got into year 7, he was still struggling at school, and then all of a sudden he came good. But what I didn't do is I didn't pressure him.
Yeah.
I loved him, and I didn't pressure him or medicate him. No, I gave him obviously lots of decent herbs and nutrition, but I just allowed him to develop. And I went to the most natural place I could. So I found a place out of town, and he went to a single teacher school, one of the last in New South Wales, actually, where there was only like 10 kids in the school from kindergarten up to year 6. And I just took him away from overstimulation.
So that's reinforcing what we've just said.
Exactly, and he's a lovely young man.
Time to regenerate.
He's 30 now. Wonderful young man.
And had a mother that would trust that her child, given time and space and nourishment at all levels, emotional, mental, physical nourishment.
And stability, without pressure. And I think this is the same as what we might apply to a horse. You need good routine, stability without pressure, to enable the organism to find its own equilibrium. And that's on all levels. And I think that all of humanity needs that. Nature needs that. That's what we're fighting for. Yeah. we need all that.
How can we help? How can BreathWork help us biologically recover from electromagnetic fields?
That I'll ask my friend Kate, who's an expert in that. But anything that takes us to a basal level metabolism, flows the breath, at least one period of that where the in and the out breaths are equal, which will works on the vagus nerve we were talking about to maximize heart rate variability, so to bring the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems back into balance. And it will lessen then. It will do something physiologically, but it will then lessen anxiety. And anxiety creates a whole lot of changes in the body anyway. So if we can lessen the anxiety through processing our fears, which is up in this time. Fear is way up here. Just to feel our fear, process it, let it go, and bring watch our emotions and process them. That's all. I don't know the chemistry. I don't know what we can do about that, but we can do a lot to create an equilibrium within ourselves.
And I think, and that's why I think, taking yourself away from being overstimulated is really, really important. And the interesting thing is that if you are doing that, you'll see there's a period of time where you're agitated. There's an agitation that occurs. If you take yourself away from being overstimulated, that agitation is something that we either start to self-medicate with, that's where alcohol comes in, all these sorts of things, we'll do to ourselves to try and cope with when we're no longer stimulated, but our body is still feeling and reeling from the effects of that stimulation. So that's why people want to medicate themselves, because it's a very uncomfortable feeling. So using the breath, as Anne said, to normalise and equalise the parasympathetic and the sympathetic nervous system via the vagus nerve. That's the vagal tone when I'm referring to vagal tone. Chamomile, by the way. Chamomile tea is a really, really good thing.
That's right. And I was thinking, it's all very well. I mean, I get clients who say it's all very well to say, breathe, but I'm agitated. So in that case, go and do something physical. Walk around the block as fast as you possibly can.
And really start getting puffed.
Yes,
Get
and then
puffed.
come back and lie down and just be still. And use the same breath that you were walking around the block really fast with to be still and breathe what remains of the anxiety out.
One of the things I did a lot of before I met Anne and did this breathwork training, I would actually swim.
Yes.
Swimming for me was the absolute panacea for me for anxiety and feeling really anxious, because it did this breathing thing. And I didn't know this at the time, but it did this breathing thing, but it also made me really tired.
Yeah.
And I could actually really sleep well. And it's one thing that I've really got to get back into is either walking or.
And also that's a really good point that you just opened then, Cath. We go in cycles. We go in cycles when we're really good. We pay attention to our diet. We pay attention to our exercise. We're on our breathing, and then we don't. And it's just like it's night sometimes, and we don't, and it's day other times. So just know that when you've fallen off the wagon, when you let your good exercise,
when you're ready. I mean, I'm a great believer in not forcing you.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's like when we're training the horses. Force does not work. Doesn't matter what sort of trainer you are. If you are forcing your horse to do anything, you're going to set up resistance, and resistance is the problem. It's exactly the same emotionally and mentally within yourself. And I think this is why a lot of forceful trainers do come out, like they are out there, because they don't understand this within their own psyche, within their own body. So if you start doing this with yourself and you're involved with animal training, this will improve your animal training without a doubt, because you'll apply the same principles to yourself, to what's happening with your animal.
Can I tell you a horse story?
Yeah, sure. Anne, by the way, did write a book, and she did present it at Equitana.
I did. But the reason I wrote this little booklet was because I was at Pony Club with a friend of mine and watching her daughters do their thing and all the other people. Now, I'm not a horse rider. And I was giving this running commentary. Oh, that kid will make it. That kid. Oh, yep, they'll make it now. And my friend looked at me, how do you know that? And I said, well, I can tell by the way they're sitting how they're breathing. And I know by the way they're breathing whether they're relaxed enough for the horse to do whatever they need to do. And so that same friend said, well, write that little book. And that was what I presented at Equitana.
At Equitana.
Yeah.
What year was that? That was
maybe 2014, something like that. Something like that. Yeah.
So we're still waiting to hear back whether or not Equitana's going this year, but we will be at Equitana if it is on. So yep.
So I'm interested in some more anecdotes because I find those very interesting. So can you give us some success stories?
Yes, I love anecdotes too. And I should have a little booklet that reminds me of that. My book of anecdotes. The latest anecdote that I've just thought was wonderful. There's all these various types of breathing, but coherent breathing, which is 6 seconds in and 6 seconds out, which maximizes heart rate variability, which brings the whole body back into balance. I was around at a friend's place, and her 84-year-old mother has been having problems sleeping forever and a day. I said, why don't you try this? Well, I think this is beyond belief, but they assure me it's true. She tried it, and in one night and go to bed by 10 o'clock. So she went to bed by 10 o'clock. She did the coherent breathing, 6 seconds in, 6 seconds out, flowing the breath in that way.
How long did she do that for?
Till she fell asleep.
Okay.
And she slept right through the night. And it's continued ever since. And I think, oh my gosh, this is the even for me, this is an exaggerated miracle story, but that's another, and that's very easy. For stress management, you can be sitting in a boring meeting and you can be counting your breaths. 6 seconds in, 6 seconds out, and you can be smiling and everyone will think you're present in there and you're just trying to maintain balance, and you are, because you're using that breath. So that's one anecdote. Have you got some more anecdotes, Kat?
Well, other than my own story,
Yeah.
which is pretty profound. I mean, I was in a pretty bad way, really, when I met you.
I've got another story.
Yeah.
I mean, I thank you to our Master of Ceremonies here, Dave, reminding me of this. I have a lot of people going through my trainings, but not all of whom want to be a breathwork practitioner. But I have one that's completed all of the 8-day modules and is on her practicum. And that means that people can come to her under my supervision and get sessions at a very reduced rate. And she was at a recent workshop and she said, when I came to Anne 3 years ago, I was beside myself. I was non-functioning. And there she was, functioning well, able to think of creating a career for herself in breathwork, because not only did she do the sessions, but she did the work at home. Because the other benefit of breathwork, you can practice it by yourself. You don't need to pay in an ongoing way some other person.
Once you learn it, you've got the technique. It's like yoga.
Yeah.
And if you're committed to doing it and you see the benefits, you can. It's a very cheap thing to do.
Yep. The investment comes back 1,000-fold.
It does, absolutely. Because once you learn it, you never forget it.
Yeah.
No, it's amazing.
So can we talk? There's a lot of issues going along in the world at the moment.
Yeah.
There's a lot of en masse anxious people. How do we deal with that?
Well, for me, if you bring yourself back into a calm state, which you can through all the breathing techniques I have, and then watch your mind, as I watch the one's mind, there's fear. And what are we frightened of? Ultimately, all fear is related to a fear of death. Well, as humans, we better get used to it because we're going to die. We mightn't want to die now, and we mightn't want to die in a particularly painful, horrible way. But life is defined by its end, birth and death. And so I think from a calm space in the body, one might begin to contemplate that. And when you're no longer frightened of death, you can live fully,
That was Osho. Osho was also talking about the fear of death, and that's certainly something that has surprised me with this whole issue of shutdown and how there is some denial of the fact that we must be never going to die from what the whole. Now, I'm not saying that it's not sad, and it's not a tragedy when that does happen to people, but it does happen.
Yeah.
And I think that understanding that of why we're so afraid of death will actually absolutely help us to not only manage this difficult time, but also to breeze through it to a certain extent.
Well, the earlier question was, how do we deal with grieving for ourselves or others? I started probably good 20 years ago watching the process of people dying, and I saw that part of that was a person grieving for themselves in letting go of life and grieving for leaving loved ones, but grieving often for a life that wasn't lived with satisfaction, with deep satisfaction. And so if that's the case, then we have to learn how to live deeply, fully,
and present, and not to deny ourselves the way of living. Yeah, no, I agree. Yeah, I do agree.
Getting back to children, someone wants to know, have you worked with teenagers or children?
I have, and I also work with a parent because we're talking about working from a systemic point of view, a systems theory. There's nothing more systemic than the family unit. So I need to work with both the parent, at least one parent, and the child. So I can teach regulation through the breathing. I can teach, encourage acceptance of the emotions. Talk about anecdote. One set of parents gave their 13-year-old daughter a present. And she, in the breathwork session, gave me a present because she just imagined herself as a dolphin swimming in the love of the pod and the family. And I said, well, she didn't say that in the beginning. She was just a dolphin swimming. And what does that mean? Oh, well, I'm safe. And it's beautiful. And I'm surrounded. It was, children, you can have experiences from agony to ecstasy. So this young, maturing girl got in her body that she was safe and part of the family and part of the pod. Yeah. So, yes, that's a short answer.
It is interesting because when you're going through these journeys of working with people, the stories and I think the artistic creativity that comes up, and I know that we did a lot of sessions where we would be doing art as part of the end of one of our sessions, and we'd be drawing either our experiences that had been happening during the week, because I can't remember, it was
once a month, one weekend a month.
It was
in those days.
one weekend a month, and I remember like the whole weekend, and the whole week after we would do this session, you'd be processing and you'd be dreaming deeply, and then and I'd be writing because I journaled a lot.
Yeah, and you did a lot of artwork at that time.
And I did a lot of artwork actually at the time. That was one of my most creative things that I was doing, because I do like to dabble in a bit of painting. And I remember doing things like mermaids and transformation and being very, very much connected to this otherworldly type of mythical. There's a lot of myth associated with the inner archetypes of our being, which it has been, I guess.
Well, we touch archetypal realms. We touch the very essence of consciousness, and that includes all of that.
So it's poetry, it's music, it's creativity. So we tap into an essence of creativity, which is a really beautiful feeling, and it does have this very, very much a feeling of expanded consciousness. You feel very unlimited when you're feeling in that state, and that's where breathwork can take you to. And I do remember having a lot of those experiences when I was working.
That's right.
with
the
you.
unblocking,
the
creative block. That's quite frequent.
Someone's asked on the email about breathwork and chronic fatigue.
It's complex, but it definitely helps, because if you're lying flat and you're feeling as if you can't move, then you can always work with the breath. And then all the physiological changes we're talking about and the mental emotional changes that happen are quite easy. So it's not a waste, and it can be a benefit.
And absolutely partnering that with herbal therapy. Yes. I think you would have to do both.
Yeah.
In order for that to be really processing well.
Yeah, I agree.
And can we just talk about breathwork? Is there an association? How do people...
Yes.
We've got people from all around the world.
Yes. Well, the Australian Breathwork Association, that's got a Find a Practitioner button on its site, and their people that are qualified practitioners on that site have had their trainings endorsed by the association, and that's I've been heavily involved in that from the time I had breathwork accredited through the government to working now through the professional association. AustralianBreathworkAssociation.org.
And there are quite a few practitioners around, and I do find that people do manage when I recommend it. I do get people finding practitioners.
And we're working a lot. We had a professional meeting about how to work online. So more and more. We're working online, sometimes fully with a breathwork session, and sometimes a truncated one. But working with a breathwork practitioner has a holistic worldview, so they're working with the total person in front of them.
And there's a question here on the email about the dangers of breathwork. Are there any dangers? How do you deal with those sort of issues?
Okay, there
Are there some people that are at more danger than others? Or?
if someone was epileptic, there's some contraindications, quite bad heart disease, then you'd be more concerned about them. But the fail-safeness of breathwork is wonderful, because if someone is going too far where they can't go, they'll fall asleep. There are techniques you can prod and push people, but I never do. But they go to their limit and they stop.
Which is where I talked about the herbal therapy to enable the body to process appropriately. So when you're blocked, you've got to come in from another angle. Yeah.
Perfect.
Okay, well, thanks, Anne. It's been a really fascinating discussion, and we've really, really loved having you. So I hope everyone out there enjoyed. Has there? Great. Well, that's
love
wonderful.
right back at you.
Thanks so much for joining us. Yeah, that's wonderful. That's wonderful.
Yeah,
Thanks so much for
great,
coming.
Cath. Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye-bye.
See you later.